All right, so I always love the week after Easter. So serious. Last week we talked about Jesus running into Peter and the fellows while they were fishing, and we talked about we didn't do a standard Easter thing. We left Jesus. We didn't feel we needed to raise him. He took care of that on his own. So it's an important moment, really, historically, and important for us is that when things in our lives go into chaos, when things get difficult, we go back to our old habits, right? Everybody does it. We just go back to whatever's comfortable, whatever we understand, whatever we know. And for the disciples, they went back to being fishermen. They went back to doing what they understood, which was fishing. They went back to something that was comfortable. Like we all go back to the old t-shirt, that's hanging in the closet. Or on the floor in the closet, wherever it happens to be. We go back to that old t-shirt. We go back to the things that we understand, the things that we know. And it's kind of what we do. And so the disciples were just doing what's normal. And I think a lot of times we look at the Bible and we read the Bible and we think to ourselves, it's almost so surreal and supernatural, and we forget about the humanity of it. We forget about the reality that these people were just real people. And today, we're going to kind of continue on talking about, Jesus reappears, right, for the third time. And he has this conversation with Peter to kind of help Peter out and to show Peter the love and compassion that he needed to get back to work, to get back to what he needed to do. He's going to show him this love, this compassion, so that he can deal with the dark inner shame of denying Christ, right? Everybody remembers Peter denied Christ. Everybody remember that?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Right, okay. It's a pretty important part. And so he's dealing with that. And so we read about this exchange, and we're going to kind of extrapolate it out and go a little further. But it says, so when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, feed my sheep. And then he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, tend my sheep. And then he said to him a third time, he said, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said it to him again. He said, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him again, feed my sheep. So this is that conversation we talked about last week, the conversation that kind of ignited Peter and his ministry. It brought him back because he kind of quit, right? He was so full of shame and fear, and he was so embarrassed about his own life. He was so embarrassed about the sin that he committed 3 times that Jesus gives him 3 chances to respond. And then all 3 times he asks him the same question, right? Do you love me? And all 3 times he got the same answer, yes. Now the third time he got a little bit of a frustrated answer, where it says that, he said Peter kind of became exasperated. He was grieved, he was frustrated, because he was like, why do you keep asking me? And it's like, I get it, I understand. And he said, then get to work, then feed my sheep. And so one of the things that we learn from this is that Jesus, oops, I didn't even have that one in there. So Jesus keeps on pursuing us relentlessly, is what we talked about last week, right? That there's not really, a lot of times we have this idea that there's things that will separate, things that will destroy the ability for us to have a relationship, the ability for us to be used by God, the ability for us to be forgiven. We feel like there's things we can do that are so bad and so awful that somehow he's going to disqualify us, and how that's not true. And so we see that Jesus just keeps on relentlessly pursuing us. And so today I want to take a little longer look at what the tentacles, how they reach in this passage, where Jesus says to him, do you love me? And Peter responds with, of course. And so then when Jesus says what? Feed and tend and care for my sheep. He says, now go and do these things. And so we're going to take a look at the correlation between the loving God and how that truth is evidenced by loving and feeding the flock. One of the most powerful metaphors in the whole Bible is the metaphor of the shepherd, right? That God is the shepherd, that we are the sheep. That I've never been a big fan of calling pastors shepherds, because I feel like that's not really accurate. But God is the shepherd, and we are the sheep. And this idea that he loves us, that he tends for us, that he cares for us, that he looks for us. And so in this moment, Jesus extends to Peter that metaphor, right? He said, then tend my sheep, care for my flock, love my people, show compassion for the people that I love. It's kind of the 23rd Psalm, right? He understands that we're kind of going through life, and he says, listen, I want you to make sure you do this. I want you to extend that love, that passion, that compassion for people. And I want you to go do it now, Peter. I want you to take it seriously and get to work. And so in one of the other recordings of his, after his resurrection, is one that's quoted a lot, right? Matthew 28. It's the Great Commission. It says, the 11 disciples went away into Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them. When they saw him, they worshipped, but some doubted. Come on, move forward. Okay, and Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I love how that one starts, right? Where it says, hey, some worship and some doubted. You know, I hear people ask all the time. It's a really common question when you're talking to people is, you know, I have doubts. I feel bad for having doubts. Okay, now, how bad do you think those guys felt having doubts? You know, Jesus is standing in front of you. The resurrected Christ is standing there talking to you and still says some doubt. There's a cop show on, a new cop show that started a few weeks ago that I watched. That I actually kind of like. It's really kooky. It's a little weird, but the guys don't get along, the two partners. And there's a conversation they have in the car one day where the one partner says, you know what, I've learned that if you just trust people, that they will trust you back. And the other cop sitting next to him looks at him and goes, have you met people? Right? Because you're kidding, right? Well, these are two people doing the same job, right? In the same car, same place in life, going the same direction. And one person says, I know that if you trust people, they'll trust you back. And the other guy's like, have you met anyone? I mean, do you know people? That's not true. And the reality is, I know people. So it's easy for me to see people worshiping and doubting at the same moment, observing the exact same thing, having the exact same experience. It's not weird to have doubts. It's not weird to have struggles. It's not weird to feel like you're on the outside looking in a little bit and go, man, it seems like everybody else is really connecting here. Why am I not? Well, that's natural. You know, I mean, Thomas doubted, right? All of them doubted. Thomas is the only one that gets to wear the cool, you know, doubter moniker, you know, in history. But all of them, it says, women, you're lying, right? So they went to see. So some worship and some doubted. It's not really that abnormal, so it's not very far-fetched. But in the middle of the exchange, we see that Jesus gives them certain specifics to what to do on the mission. Now, we talk about these all the time in the church, right? He says one is to go. The next one is to disciple, right? And the last one is to teach them to observe all things that I've commanded you. Those are kind of the three phases of the Great Commission, right? Go, disciple, and then teach them to observe. Very common, talked about a lot. But as I was thinking about the resurrection, and I was thinking about the things that Christ did and the conversations that he had, it's interesting that I wonder if maybe we're not really looking at the true thing, and I get to the point of what exactly was the lesson. He says, teach them to observe all things that I have commanded you. So if how many of you guys have been Christians or been a part of the church for more than 10 years? Okay, and I said, go teach the lesson of Jesus Christ. I'm not asking you to yell it out. You know, this is not romper room. See, kids, romper room. Actually, that's before my time. So, you know, I'm not gonna, you know, but what is the lesson? He says, teach them to observe all things that I've commanded you. What was the lesson of Jesus Christ? He says, feed my sheep, tend my lambs, take care of the people that I love. But what's the lesson there? How do you tend, how do you take care of, how do you deal with if you don't really understand what the actual lesson was? And see, it's easy to say go and disciple, but what exactly are you discipling people to? Are you discipling to be like you? What exactly? I got to thinking more and more about this last week. What is the lesson that Christ taught? Because I don't think he sat there and went, now here, go, write everything down that I said and make sure you get it into as many hands of people as possible. Right? I don't think that was what Jesus meant by go teach everybody, now hurry up and write everything down. Because you notice the disciples were not in a hurry to write it down. If you're a fan of history, if you know anything about biblical history, they didn't write it down right away. They were too busy doing what? Living it. Right? Writing it down was a, hey, we should probably write this down. You know, the Holy Spirit's like, yeah, here, let me tell you what to put there real quick. This isn't a message about winning people to the gospel. I think the Great Commission a lot of times is this message about winning people to the gospel. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure I understand what that means. I've heard it said most of my life that you got to go win people to the gospel. It sounds cool. It's kind of like romper room. I say it. I don't know what it means. But the reality is we have this idea that somehow we go up to some poor poor Schlep, who's the slow gazelle, and we catch him, and we tell them about Jesus, and we work our way through our systematic theology with the hopeful goal of long-term leading them in the sinner's prayer. I think a lot of times that's kind of our attitude about winning people to the gospel. And so we kind of come up with the easiest, most simple gospel presentation we can so they can remember it, so they can make it easy. And we do the best we can. Because we have this idea that teaching is some sort of transfer of knowledge, right? Teaching is a transfer of knowledge. But we get so enamored with transferring like mental data that we kind of have a philosophy on how to teach it. You know, Andy Stanley says that, you know, the biggest problem we have in church is that everybody thinks the best way to do church is to line everybody up in rows and talk at them. Now keep in mind, he's a pastor of a church with like 20,000 people, so he has a lot of rows, a lot of people he's talking to. Right? But he has this idea that somehow that's our best way to do things. And, you know, I feel like, at least as far as kind of most people go, I have pretty broad knowledge of things that I can do. You know, and one of the things that I love to do is construction. I love to build. I love to do those things. I really enjoy those things. My dad taught me how to do all of that. My dad never once talked to me on how to do anything. All right? My dad never once went, hey, Adam, come here. I'm going to write this down for you. My dad never once went, okay, step 1, buy nice straight boards. Got that? You know, never did that. My dad never went, hey, you know, come here, let me walk you through. I've got, you know, my dad never once went, oh, look, the instructions. Never. Ever. You know what I'm saying? I mean, ever. I didn't know that there were multiple languages in those things. You know, he never once did that. This is how my dad showed me how to do things. And me going, I'm watching. I learned by watching. You know, I did. That's how I learned stuff. Growing up, that was my connection with my father was by watching my dad do awesome stuff. And like one day, he would start here, and the next day I would come back, and there would be like a high-rise. You know, and I would just, you know, but I learned by watching, by listening. My dad taught me more stuff without ever being aware that I was even watching. Some good, some bad. You know, my dad was definitely a dichotomous individual. But that's what I learned. I learned so much from him. And there was never a step-by-step series of instructions. There was never a Bob Lima doctrine of life. There was never, you know, my dad was a severe dyslexic, so for my father, you know, writing is not going to be a natural thing anyway. And so for him, there was never this ability to walk me through steps. It was just, I'll show you. I remember there was a few times he tried to walk me through steps, and it ended up just, because he'd skip a step and be like, no, you know, and then, sorry son, I forgot to, let's go back to, just do it, Dad. I'll remember how you did it. I'll learn. And that's how I learned to do things. That's how I got involved in things. I'm one of those people, just show me how to do it. You know, teaching comes from a lot of different angles, but we've had this tendency, and Leonard Sweet says that the problem with the Protestant church is it's married to print. The Protestant church likes to put things in writing because that's the best way for people to learn. And it's not. The best way for people to learn is to observe you doing all things and learn how to do them. And so I got to this idea of thinking about what exactly was that lesson. You know, when he says, I want you to teach him to observe everything. I want you to teach him to take it all in. I want you to teach them to live by the things that I taught you. Jesus lived his life through compassion and love. He didn't live his life to come out and say, here's the information of the gospel. The teaching was the byproduct of the lifestyle. The teaching was sort of the secondary. The presentation of the gospel will never work if it's presented in written form. It doesn't work that way. But we have always tried to present it in written form. We've always tried to present and disciple through written form, but that's not the intent. The disciples were so busy after Jesus went, okay, I'm going to go to heaven now. You guys take care of things. I'll be back later. And then he says, because he's lo, I'm with you always, right? They were so excited that they went out and did the work. They were so excited they ran out and they showed compassion and love, because the gospel presentation isn't going to work if presented in written form. But a lot of us, how many of us have ever given out a tract? Remember those, right? You rip the rubber band off, and the churches were full the next weekend because people were like, right? I get watchtowers constantly. Good people. But I get watchtowers constantly. I open them, I read them. I do, because I like to know what other people think. I read them, and I chuckle. Right? I don't read them and go, oh, well, they spent the time putting this in print, so it must be true. We have this idea somehow that it's all about print. The reality is the gospel was meant to be presented in living form. The gospel is meant to be presented in lifestyle and in how we live and in how we move and the things we say and the compassion and love that we show people. And Jesus showed compassion and love throughout his entire ministry, never really feeling like, hey, you don't see him where he sits there and says, okay, everybody quick, grab a pen. I'm about to roll on this Sermon on the Mount. He doesn't say that, right? He doesn't say, hurry up. Dude, you guys got to write this baby down, because someday there's going to be this thing called the internet. And I'm going to want this thing in every language. I want it in Swahili, right? I want it in that clicky language. I want it in everything, right? He never says that. He never says, hurry up, man, we got to get this baby, we got to get this thing, over and get it printed. He never says that. It's meant to be lived. It's meant to be a part of our lifestyle and the things that we show through how we live. One of the things that I have always found crazy is that most of the Christians that I know who've been Christians a long, long time are like the most crusty, angry people. But they know all the rules, but they're nothing like Jesus. It's never meant to be absorbed in a written form. It's meant to be lived. And so in Matthew 9, it says, then Jesus, this is very often talked about passage, great passage. Then Jesus went to all the cities and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease from among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. And he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So the first thing that's interesting is Christ went to where the sheep were, right? It says he went where? He went to their villages, he went to their towns, he went to their synagogues. He went to all the places that they were to experience life with them, to be a part of who they were, to see what was going on. So when he says to Peter, feed my sheep, love my sheep, you got to go to them. You have to be a part of their lives. You have to be in things with them. You have to encounter their existence with them. He wasn't saying, hurry up and teach them stuff. He was saying, get in there. Watch, I lived it. Jesus lives it out in front of them constantly. He's constantly exempling this, how to live the gospel out. And then it says that we see that Jesus was moved with compassion by those that he came in contact with, because he became aware of their circumstances, their spiritual position, the things that were going on, and it was presented in front of him everywhere he went. And the Bible says that his body was physically responded. It actually hurt. Anybody ever have genuine compassion on somebody where you actually hurt for somebody, you ache for somebody, you actually feel sick for somebody? Right? We've all been there, right? We've all done it, where we just, it happens as a parent with your kids, right? You just sit there and your kid goes and does just something knuckleheadish. Not that my kids have ever done anything wrong, but you go and do something knuckleheadish, right? And they're in trouble, and you're just like, it hurts, right? You're like, I feel bad, what my kid's going through. But it's like that kind of moving compassion is what Jesus has, because he understood, because he walked amongst the people and he understood the circumstances they were facing, and he saw the difficulties that they have going on. It's amazing how insensitive we are to people we don't understand. We are the most insensitive. Human beings are insensitive to people we don't get. We decide that what makes us different is too much to palate, and we're insensitive to people because they're different than us. I'm not just talking about right or left on the political spectrum. Big time differences. But we find ourselves so insensitive to people because we don't understand. We can't sympathize with those pains, those circumstances they're going through. But it's amazing what happens when we are enlightened to them. You ever had somebody say, would it make a difference if I told you when you're upset at somebody? And you're like, I don't like that person. Man, you ever had somebody look at you and go, but would it make a difference if I told you, ... You always find yourself going, yeah, I guess that'd make a difference if it were true. Right? Oh, it is. Oh, man, I'm a jerk. Right? Anybody ever been through that? No? I've been a jerk a few times. Yeah. I admit it, I'm a jerk a lot. But not when I'm presented with the facts. But but it's amazing, like the difference that we feel. And then Jesus says, listen, I want you to pray for workers. I want you to passionately seek workers because we need them, because people are hurting. I think we've always kind of taken this whole idea of the harvest as being a hurry up, we need evangelists so we can go out and fill the churches with people. But that's not what compassion's about. He's like, listen, pray the Lord of the harvest to send people into it. Because we need people out here. Because Jesus says, look, they're worried, they're scattered, they're hurting. We need people out here in this environment caring for them. We don't need people to come out and hurry up and gather up as many souls as possible and bundle them and put them in the church. That way they're in the storehouse for heaven and everything's good. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, listen, people are hurting. We need to have compassion on their circumstances and quit worrying about a lot of the stuff that doesn't matter and have compassion. Have an actual affection for these people because we need workers right now. And then Jesus modeled for Peter a lifestyle of getting out into the crowds. Jesus did very little of his work inside the church. Jesus did very little of his fine work in a church environment. Most of his fine work was outside in crowds, dealing with people where they were at. People walking up to him saying, "Listen, I'm deaf. I can't hear anything," or walking up to him and saying, "Listen, hey, my brother's blind. And since you happen to be walking by, I thought I would address you, great healer." And all these things are going on. Because Jesus is out there. And it's amazing what happens when you start putting yourself out there and you get involved in your communities. How many times you run into people and they're like, hey, I'm going through this, I'm going through that. And you find yourself totally available to them. You find yourself able to bring healing, able to bring compassion, able to bring love, able to bring, wisdom if that's what's necessary, whatever. It's amazing how few of those people would ever find you in here. People don't come in here, unless you have a connection, then you might. But the reality is most people will encounter you out in the real world. But that's the church, right? The church, we're really good at learning. We're really good at the classroom, but sometimes I wonder how good we are on the playground. Right? We are really, everyone's like, I majored in recess. But, but the reality is most of us are really good in the classroom. We can sit there and I can tell you that, the 14 fundamental truths, and I can tell you guys are 14. The 14 fundamental truths, I can tell you about all these things, and I can walk you through everything. But how good are we with that on the playground? How good are we with that outside? How good are we with that compassion and that love for people in our communities? How good are we at showing patience with people away from? How good are we at bringing that message in living form to people who need to see it? How good are we at that? Jesus showed this deep compassion for people and this love for them before he ever said a word to them. Because that builds equity. If someone genuinely loves you and cares for you and shows compassion and concern for you, then you don't feel like there's an ulterior motive in things that you're doing because there's a genuine love and concern, right? But if someone just walks up off the street and starts hammering away at you with the guidelines of the gospel presentation, it feels contrived. It feels like you're just trying to check a box in your evangelism work. That's the reality of what Jesus does. So I wonder, we're so good at teaching people to observe things by knowing the rules, by understanding the print form. In Mark 1:41, Jesus is confronted by a leper who says, "If you're willing to heal me," and says, and Peter, Mark is a book that is the memoirs of Peter, just recorded by Mark. It says, "Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing. I'm willing to do this. I don't know what about me would have ever said I'm not." Right? I'm willing because you have come, you have presented yourself, but Jesus was out and about again. And it says that he showed compassion, that he was moved by compassion to care for this individual and the things that they were going through. And it's just like what Jesus is talking about in John 21, where he says, "Feed my sheep, care for my lambs." You have to get out and care for them. He says they're scattered, right? Well, if they're scattered, that means you have to go find them. We just don't ring the dinner bell. But for a long time, that's why we put a bell on a church, right? Hey, every time you go to church, go find Jesus. And the reality is that's not how it works. Jesus is saying, listen, you have to be out there with the sheep who are hurting. You have to be out there with the people who are suffering. You have to go through those things. And it's not just about waiting for them to come to you. We can't just get caught up in the whiteboard of discipleship and lose sight of the modeling of the gospel when it comes to compassion and love. We get caught up in the whiteboard. Teach me more. Teach me more. Teach me more. Teach me more. I would not take classes on things that didn't matter to me. Do you guys? I would love to know the world about, metallurgy. Are you going to do anything with it? No. Just want to look really smart when metallurgy comes up in conversation. Right? No? But that's how we are in church, isn't it? We want to know everything. Tell me everything. Well, what are you using? None of it. Really? I'm using it to make myself feel guilty and awful all the time. Does that help for anything? Yes, that's what we're going for here. Guilt and awfulness, right? But that's not what it's intended for. The message of the gospel is intended for compassion and love and caring for people. The book of Hebrews records that, talking about the high priest that would go into the Holy of Holies and make the sacrifice, it says, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. So what the author of Hebrews is saying is, listen, the reason that God chooses that high priest is because that high priest understands what it means to be the other guy. That high priest walks in there to present an offering and a sacrifice and to stand in the gap, right? To stand between God and mankind and create this massive sacrifice. But he did it because he understood what it was like to be the dude outside who was depending on his sacrifice. The guy outside needed that guy to go in there and do that, or else his sins weren't forgiven, right? We're talking about pre-Christ here, obviously. Everybody got that? I know, I'm flashing all over. Very Quentin Tarantino-ish. So just try to stay with the story. It will end with Genesis. It's great. But the whole idea is a high priest, he goes in to create this sacrifice that this guy outside absolutely needs, but it's dangerous to go into the Holy of Holies, right? Because you have to be pure, you have to be clean. That's why they were like, hey, look, if you drop dead, we'll just pull you out by a rope. It's not made up. They tie a rope around the poor guy, just in case God killed him. Just drag his corpse out. So he went in there with a little bit of fear. We don't go into churches like that anymore. You're like, step in. How's everybody doing? Right? Maybe we should start that. But that's the whole idea is that we have this priest goes in and he does it because he loves people outside and he's willing to risk his life to make sure that those people have their sins forgiven. But he's only willing to risk his life because he understands what it's like to be those people who need their sins forgiven. And it's the same thing with Peter. Peter was a dynamo of confidence for Jesus, but wasn't really equipped to go do the work that Jesus wanted him to do until he made the mistakes and was forgiven. Because then all of a sudden Peter's like, I know what it means to be given and gifted compassion by Christ. So I can go give that compassion out because I get it. Jesus put on flesh so that he understood us, so that he could see and feel and know the pain that we go through when it comes to the things that we feel, the things that we encounter, the things that we go through. And so that we could basically, so that his compassion for us would be born out of his understanding of flesh. And that was kind of the whole idea of that, the compassion of the high priest, basically out of his awareness of sin. That's the only reason the high priest would ever do that, is because he understood it. And so, like I said, in those three people, you have the priest that had compassion because of his experience, Peter had compassion because of his experience, and Jesus had compassion because of his flesh. Now, it's weird to think that Jesus would be moved with compassion, isn't it? He already renounced his deity to come to earth. I think that's more than enough. You know, you ever tell somebody who's doing nice things for you, no, you've done enough? Right? The day that Jesus became flesh, we should have just went, you did enough, thank you. That's enough. You don't need to do anymore, but he's moved with compassion again. Peter later on calls us a royal priesthood, right? Right? You guys remember that? Made a cool song back in the 80s. You know, the idea that we are a royal priesthood is that that's who we are in Christ, is this idea of priestliness, that we basically stand in the gap for the people in our lives, that God has raised us up from the situations we're in because we can better serve people because we understand what it's like to be them. It's amazing how quickly we forget that we were just there a few months ago. And it's amazing how quickly Christians become judgmental and rigid and angry and frustrated with people who were just the exact same as they were just a couple days ago. You know, like I said, when people have been Christians their whole life and you're just like, why are you so angry? You know, because everybody's a sinner but me. And I get tired of these, you know, and I get it, okay, I've been guilty. Occasionally, of the driving by the park and you see the kids out with their doobies. And you're like, get a life, get a job, stick it kids, ruining the world. They're going to be voters someday. Voters, right? Okay, just me. The rest of you guys don't suffer that feeling sometimes. But you know, the reality is, you know, there's a reason they're sitting there, right? There is. I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's different for every kid, right? I'm not going to sit here and go, oh, it's because their lives are sad. No, sometimes it's just because they want to smoke pot. But, you know, the reality is there's a lot of things going on, but understanding the story of the things that they're going through, things they're encountering makes a difference. Having compassion on them instead of initially starting with judgment. But we neglect compassion, right? We neglect it all the time. Jesus says, teach them to observe the lifestyle I live, but we neglect compassion because we're so caught up in proper Christianity and what our culture thinks about what we think. The church is so obsessed with what our culture thinks about what we think. You know, we're like, oh, you know, I can't, you know, am I allowed to think this anymore? Am I allowed to go through this? That's why I brought that stuff up at the beginning. It's because we're so obsessed with what the church, what the world thinks about what we think. I had a friend of me the other day say, oh, you know, ISIS is killing Christians everywhere, waging war on the world. And here in America, we're worried about whether or not a gay couple can have cake at their wedding. And I went, yeah, that's true. And I said, yeah, and people in our culture are dying and starving, struggling, and our churches are worried about what to name their multi-million-dollar four-year extension. I mean, if you're going to call everybody out, you might as well, right? The reality is amazing how rigid we become, and how rooted we become, and how unwilling we are to just walk across the street. The Good Samaritan, right? The Levite wasn't allowed to help him. But Jesus includes him in the story anyway. The Levite was not allowed to help him because he was unclean. You guys get that, right? He wasn't allowed to. Religious culture said you can't go over there and help because you're a Levite. You can't touch that guy. And the Samaritan comes along and goes, well, goodness, somebody needs to help this guy. I'm going to help him. I'm going to go pay for him, whether I ever get anything back or not. Who cares? He stepped across the line. You know, and as Christians, Jesus is constantly creating scandal with his relationships because he has compassion, because he wants to be where people are hurting. You know, I've said it 1,000 times and I'll keep saying it. You know, the Bible says that he loved to hang out with sinners and sinners loved to hang out with him. That means that he probably wasn't being very religious. You know, you want to get the quickest way to get yourself uninvited to a party? Go be all religious. I mean, unless it's a religious party, then be, you know. Rock on. But, right? Best thing you do is just go in there and just start pointing out everything everybody's doing wrong. Hey, welcome to the party. Excuse me, I didn't. Alcohol? The Bible says, right? You're like, yeah, you need to go now. You know, but that's what Jesus was doing. Why? Because people liked him. People wanted him there. Why did they want him there? Because he cared. Because he actually had compassion. Because he actually liked talking with them. Usually when I go places, man, I'll sit and talk to the same person for 2 hours. And it might drive some of y'all nuts. That's just life. Because that's it. Because I actually do care. about what's going on with you. And actually do want to listen. You know, I mean, I could float around like a butterfly, talk to everybody, say hello, and pat you on the head, but, you know, I mean, chase you to your car. You know, but the reality is that's not authentic, right? You know, the thing is that we have to care and have compassion on people, and we have to be the kind of person people want at things where it's not very religious. You know, we have to be the kind of people who actually go into people's houses when it's smelly and stinky and a little weird and actually care about them. We actually have to go into our communities. You know, it's one of the reasons I love to be a part of sports and stuff like that, is because I'm actually in the community. I get to know people. You know, and that's what we need to do. But that's the life Jesus modeled for us. He said, look, you got to get out. You know, this isn't about making sure everybody who's religious is taken care of. This is about going into and being that Samaritan where sometimes you walk across the street and you reach into a ditch and you help a guy who's bloody and beaten and, you know, is just at the end. And you reach down to that ditch and you help him out, but you know, it didn't end there, right? The Samaritan didn't bandage his wounds and go, here's a canteen, loaded him up, took him someplace, paid for him to be cared for. You know, that's the messiness. I was talking to a friend last week who actually called me by accident. We were texting, and we never talk. I mean, we text from time to time, but he lives down in San Diego, and he texted out this sort of text informing me that they had a little child that they take kids in, they care for them, and they raise them, and they had a I think she was 5 months old. They'd had her since she was 2 weeks old, and they've been raising this little girl. Well, one of her extended family members showed up and was going to take her and adopt. And anyway, the correlation was, this was a friend of mine from college, and this person who showed up was a friend from another friend's church that was my roommate in college, but they're states away, so it was kind of interesting. So he was just telling me the coincidence, and I said, so what happened? I said, was this a good thing? And he goes, yeah. He goes, it's painful, but it was outstanding. This family came to raise her. She'll get to grow up with her brother and sister, I guess, that they are already taken care of. And so he's telling me the story, and I said, man, that's gotta be hard, dude. And he goes, oh, it's horrible. He said letting her go, he said we go through this all the time. They've ended up, I think they have two that they've actually permanently adopted, that they've brought in. But he's like, we've had her since she was 2 weeks old. You know, and they're giving her away. They're putting her in the car with somebody who's a family member who's going to go take care of her. But he said, you know, that's what God's called us to do. You know, and I'm like, I can't fathom caring enough. Because anybody who's ever had a child knows how hard that is, how exhausting that is. Caring enough and loving a child enough to go through all of that, to go, you know, but that's compassion. You know, and I told him, I said, what's amazing is that little girl has life because you cared. If it wasn't for you, that little girl wouldn't have life. That little girl has life because you had compassion on her circumstances. You had compassion on her, on where she was at. You know, and that's how we're kind of called to be as the church, is compassion and love for the people who we come in contact with. And that's the lesson, right? That's what we're taught to observe, is what Jesus did daily. Not what the specifics of how your systematic theology works out. That's great. If you got a good one, more power to you. But it's really about, are you modeling Christ in your compassion and your love for people? Are you giving people the time that they need? You know, are you going and spending, you know, countless hours actually listening to stuff that's going on with people in your community? You know, or are we basically just sort of, you know, circling the wagons and kind of on that sort of highway to become Levites, to where we won't walk across the street for somebody because they're just a little too shabby, a little too dirty, a little too smelly. You know, those darn kids. You know, and that's kind of the reality of what he's saying. He said, Peter, now go and do this. Feed my sheep, tend to my lambs. And it's the same charge all of us have been given. The gospel in our lives is to be lived, not written down. You know, and the question is what are you better at? Are we better at what we know, or are we better at what we show, right? You know, because you will never regret compassion on people, and people will always benefit from your compassion. Yeah, you're going to have those relational locusts. They're my favorite. That's my favorite word, right? Relational locusts. You can steal it. It's okay. Just cite your sources. Relational locust, right? You know what that is? Somebody who comes into your life like a swarm of locusts, just descends upon you, eats you for everything you've got, and jumps to the next field. Right? Where you're just like, dude, this person, what? And they're gone, right? And you got nothing left to give anybody. Because you just spent the whole day dealing with a relational locust, right? No? And we've all been a locust once or twice, right? But I love, that you're going to encounter people like that are just going to constantly take. But the truth is, you will never regret continuing to recharge through what you know about Christ and genuine compassion and getting back out there and listening to people and caring for people and talking with people and getting to understand the people, what their story is, where they come from, what the pain is. If at the end of my life I'm more accused of being too friendly with people outside the church, I'm not going to regret that. I like a little scandal with my relationships. Christians should have scandal with their relationships. You should have that moment where you're like, uh-oh, hope they don't see me. Right? You should every now and then, And that guy's judgmental. If he sees me here, boy, I'm never going to end up in church. Right? Who cares? Are you modeling Christ and compassion for people? I'll high five you if I see you at a party. All right? As long as you don't see me. Yeah. All right. So let's close in prayer. And let's go have some compassion this week. And have a great ministry. Father, we just thank you so much for the energy at our youth group this week, with all the fun that they had. We thank you for the week off for a lot of people who had spring break. We thank you for the life that you lived and that model that you lived, that we're not supposed to be judgmental. We're supposed to be compassionate and loving and not so caught up in making sure that we have everything written down and organized, but that we're living it. That we're living it, that we're actually in tune with where you want us to be and what you want us to do. So God, we pray for that in our lives. God, I thank you for this group of people. I pray for a great week of ministry. And God, I pray that we can all go love sinners this week. We can all go love people the way you did and create an environment where people feel welcome with us. People feel engaged with us. People feel like we actually do genuinely care about them, that we'll go out of our way for them. Without ever having to say a word about what we believe. But just letting them see you through us, that we can be armed with our lifestyle, that we can be, using that to care for people and to show the love and compassion, grace and forgiveness that you have shown. And God, if there's areas in our life where we're challenged, or areas where we're withholding forgiveness, God, we would give forgiveness, that we can give forgiveness. Because compassion really, it begins at home. And if we don't have compassion at home, then any compassion we show outside the home is honestly, it's fake. And so God, I just pray that we can be forgiving, we can be passionate, filled with compassion for the people in our lives, for the people we meet. That our community can know the touch of Jesus because we are present in caring for people. In your name, amen. All right, you guys, go have fun. The Masters is on.